do that. I don't want to. Okay.
Better. Yes, by far. Okay, good. Let's start again. Okay, so my background is in neuroscience and nuclear medicine. And as I'm sure you can tell from my accent, I'm Italian. I was born and raised in Florence, in Italy. And that's really where I started thinking about food and nutrition as something that is so important for the health of your brain. However, my studies led me to work in medicine to start with. And as you know, Western medicine is all about intervention, either by means of drugs and pills or surgery. And I'm here today to tell you that there is perhaps a better approach to brain health that starts with prevention. And this is a big deal in my field, in the field of Alzheimer's disease, because I would say even just 5 years ago, nobody would dare talk about prevention. And most people just thought that it was just not feasible. So today I would like to convince you otherwise, and that we all really need to take steps to make sure that we are healthy and that the health of our brain depends on us in very large part. So, can you hear me? Okay, good. So I'm going to start with some good news. We live longer. As a society, we have experienced a steady increase in life expectancy, which is really, really fantastic. However, the not so good news is that living longer does not necessarily mean being healthier. For many people, old age does not mean an increased quality of life. And for many people, getting older really increases risk for age-related brain diseases like Alzheimer's disease. Everybody has heard about Alzheimer's disease. It's the most common form of dementia, affecting 5.7 million people in the United States alone. So it's a real concern. If you were to look into a medical textbook, you would read that Alzheimer's is a progressive neurodegenerative disease that causes deficits in memory and judgment, in language and thinking, and of course activities of daily living. And that is very much correct, but does not give any justice to what really happens to people. And I can tell you that because my grandmother had Alzheimer's disease and suffered terribly. She's the one in the middle. That was my first communion. And my grandmother developed Alzheimer's when she was about 80 years old. And just a couple of years later, her sister, the one to the right, developed exactly the same thing, though she suffered from mixed dementia or vascular dementia with a strong stroke component. And then finally, her younger sister developed exactly the same age. You can just imagine how concerned my mother is and how concerned I am about my future, my mom's future, my daughter's future. So my family history, if you will, led me to really appreciate that Alzheimer's is a huge threat that people don't fully address medically, because we think of Alzheimer's as something that turns on when we're old. And that is just so not the case, and I'm going to show you that in a minute. We are facing an Alzheimer epidemic. Of all the challenges to aging in our century, nothing compares to the unprecedented scale of Alzheimer's disease. By 2050, close to 15 million people will have Alzheimer's disease in our country, in the United States alone. These are the populations of Los Angeles, Chicago, and New York put together. It's a huge problem. In addition to that, there will be 3 to 4 times more people with some forms of cognitive impairment, not to mention caregivers. More bad news, and then I'm going to stop with the bad news. We don't really have a treatment for Alzheimer's at this point. We have some drugs like donepezil, Aricept, memantine. They do work, they help with symptoms, but only for a limited amount of time, and they also come with a lot of side effects. Many scientists have been trying to develop vaccines for Alzheimer's, so drugs that can actually stop Alzheimer's disease and really address the cause of the disease. We're not so optimistic because all the clinical trials so far failed, all of them. So we're either not asking the right question, or perhaps we're not going about it the right way. And that really made me wonder, and makes so many other people wonder, are drugs the only goal? Or could we have other approaches and solutions that are just as effective, if not better, at this point? So pretty much all scientists agree that we intervene too late. We just wait until people have Alzheimer's instead of starting prior to. And really, our best bet to prevent or mitigate the disease is to strike before it takes place, before it has affected the brain so much that drugs don't show efficacy at that point. So how do we do that? Who do we treat? How do we know who is a risk for Alzheimer's? We have no silver bullet to predict who's going to develop Alzheimer's, but we have very important new tools and technologies that help us as clinicians and scientists to identify people at risk. Two technologies in particular have really changed the way that we think about brain aging in this century. On one hand, over there, we have cheap genomics. That doesn't mean it's lousy, it just means that finally we can afford it, where we can look at people's DNA one by one and understand genetic predisposition. On the other hand, we have these brain scans techniques, and my background is in nuclear medicine, which is really code for brain imaging. We do a lot of studies where we're looking at the brain and we try to understand living function, chemistry, pathology, structure, over time, and most importantly, before anybody gets sick. It's thanks to this kind of techniques and studies that we have shown, and others have shown as well, that Alzheimer's disease is not a disease of old age. The disease unfolds over a 20 to 40 year period prior to clinical symptoms. What happens is that there are many genetic, lifestyle, and environmental factors that damage the brain when we're still young. They seem to have a really strong impact in midlife, around age 40, 50, 60, and they really trigger changes in the brain that then lead to the change from normal cognition to mild cognitive impairment to dementia and loss of independent function in older age. Now, if you look at the yellow box over there, it really means that we have pretty much 60 or 70 years of time before anybody develops symptoms of Alzheimer's. And this is a pretty lengthy gap. It means that we have a lot of time to implement prevention therapies, and actually usually after age 60 as well. So the real question is, what produces risk for Alzheimer's? There are three main factors. Number one, genetics. Something that you have in your DNA that frankly we can't do much about. But the very important thing is that many people think of Alzheimer's as something that you have in your DNA, as something that is being transmitted to you from your parents and all of a sudden turns on when you're old. That is not the case. Less than 1% of the population develops Alzheimer's because of genetic mutations. Less than 1%. I can't even tell you how many of our patients do not realize that, and they're so scared that they may have a genetic mutation that is causative of Alzheimer's. It is true that many people have family history of Alzheimer's, like me. There are susceptibility genes, but these factors are not deterministic. They don't make you develop Alzheimer's disease. Then we have other factors that can actually be modified. Medical illnesses would be number one. There are many medical diseases that affect the brain and impact one's likelihood of developing Alzheimer's in old age. These are diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular disease, stroke is a big one, hypertension, depression, toxin exposures, infections, metabolic problems, and I'm going to say also hormones for women, especially for postmenopausal women. These are risks that can be modified by means of appropriate medical interventions. And then there are risks that can be completely eliminated that we should really focus on, all of us. And these come from our lifestyle. Lack of exercise, smoking, too much alcohol, some drugs, lack of social interactions, lack of intellectual stimulations, and in particular, a poor diet. These are all factors that we don't usually think about when we consider Alzheimer's disease, but very recently have been shown to have a huge, huge impact. In fact, it was recently estimated that at least 1 in 3 Alzheimer's cases could be prevented by addressing these risk factors that I just showed you: medical illnesses and lifestyle. At least 1 in 3. That's a lot of people that just don't need to get Alzheimer's if they just change the way they live. In particular, as far as my research is concerned, that diet plays a huge role for brain health. I think we all intuitively know that the foods we eat have an effect in our brains, right? When you're having a hard day or you're feeling a little bit sad, most people will reach for a piece of chocolate or maybe a cupcake or some ice cream. And that's because the foods we eat really have the capacity to go inside our brains and change the very chemistry of our brains, for the good or for the bad. Now, in 2010, we usually associate diets with the way we look. Most people think about the foods they eat as something that's going to impact their waistline, the way they look, perhaps their fitness. But in reality, food really changes our brain and the way we think. And I think as a society, we're very comfortable thinking that the foods we eat change the way we look. We're just not as comfortable thinking that what we eat has an effect inside our brains. Now, usually the question I get from our patients or friends or colleagues is, well, what should I eat? There's so much confusion about brain and nutrition. And I would say, as a scientist, I never noticed that until I really started doing research in this field. And it's absolutely true. There seems to be a really huge disconnect between popular science and actual science. So there's a divide between books, popular science books, that are very accessible and are very often inaccurate. And if they're not inaccurate, they're strange. One day you're told you have to be vegan. The next day you can't touch brain or grains and you have to eat fat all the time, all day long. That's very strange for a scientist. However, on the other hand, you do have scientific articles that are accurate, but they're really largely inaccessible. They sit between a paywall, behind a paywall, and even if you were to have access to them, they would be very, very hard to read because of the scientific lexicon. So today, I would like to share our research insights on brain health, and especially brain nutrition, and how the foods we eat really affect our likelihood of aging gracefully over time with our mental capacities intact, or developing dementia and cognitive decline instead. So why is that? It is because really the brain is built on food. The brain is the most delicate organ of our body, is the fattest organ, and yet it's the most metabolically active. Your brain takes up 20 to 25% of all the calories you consume in a day. On top of that, the brain relies entirely on food for energy, for nourishment and functionality through a constant blood supply of dietary nutrients. So what you eat will go inside your brain and change the functionality of your brain. However, the brain is a little bit different from the rest of your body. It's a really picky eater. It works according to, if you will, its own taste. And the reason for that is that the brain is literally protected from the rest of the body and the rest of you by a structure that is called the blood-brain barrier. That is literally a barrier around the brain that comes with little gates, and these gates will open and close when the brain needs food, and it's your brain that operates the gates. So the brain is not a sponge. It's not like whatever you eat will get inside your brain. It's quite the opposite. It's the brain itself that will ask for food, open the doors, get the food, close the doors. So it's really important to understand what kind of nutrients can get in and what kind of nutrients cannot, because that really has consequences on the health of your brain. You want to feed your brain the right nutrients, you don't need anything else. And that's quite interesting if you think about it. It's a very protective mechanism that evolved during millions of years that led to our modern brains. So we are what we eat, but we also are what we ate. And if you're interested in any nutrients particularly, these are the only nutrients that can get inside your brain. Oxygen is not necessarily a nutrient, but you need it. Water, glucose, a sugar, vitamins and minerals, very important. Very specific amino acids, which are like kinds of proteins, small parts of proteins. For fats, polyunsaturated fats is a big name. That means the famous omega-3s that you can find in drugstores and everywhere in commercials and advertisements. It's really important to have these brain fats. Phospholipids, big word that we don't usually hear in the news, but it's really something that your brain needs and craves. And ketone bodies, they're famous now because everybody's on ketogenic diets. I don't know if you heard about them. No, good for you. I get that question like all the time. And these are the nutrients that cannot get inside your brain. Cholesterol, number one. I hear all the time that the brain is made of fat, and therefore we need to eat fat to feed our brain. Incorrect. Cholesterol cannot get inside your brains. There are no gates to let the cholesterol in. Saturated fat does not get inside your brain, or better, the brain doesn't want it after adolescence. So if you need a steak, if you eat some cheese, that's good for you, your brain will get none of that. Transaturated fats cannot get inside your brain. Fiber cannot get inside your brain. Sugars other than glucose cannot get inside your brain. And non-essential proteins cannot get inside your brain. So you could tell the menu is limited here. And we need to make sure that the brain has access to all the foods up there in white, because that's really what your brain needs to stay healthy and be able to function. And my slides got stuck. Yeah. Sorry for that. Okay, let's try again. Good. So, the importance of these nutrients that I mentioned is obvious when we look at how the brain works. Okay, good. So, the brain relies on glucose, a sugar, for energy. Glucose is really responsible for 99% of all your brain energy, and is also a precursor to most major neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are those chemicals that literally jump from one neuron to the next, carrying information. So if you're happy, it's because your brain is making a neurotransmitter called serotonin. If you are moving, it's because your brain is making a neurotransmitter called dopamine. All these neurotransmitters need glucose just to be synthesized inside your brain. So the brain needs sugar. However, it's not the kind of sugar most people think about, or that we would like to think about. Something that's really telling is that nobody really knows how much glucose we need. You know how the government is always telling us what to do. You should eat this much of the omega-3 fatty acids. You should eat that much protein. You should eat that much carbohydrates. Nobody really knows how much glucose we need, which is telling. However, from brain imaging studies, we and others determined that the brain needs 32 micromoles of glucose per 100 grams of brain tissue per minute, which in English means 62 grams a day. This is roughly 250 calories a day from glucose, which is not much. And most people will say, well, I'll just have a cookie, right? But the truth is that some foods are very rich in glucose, and some foods are not rich in glucose at all. So if you were to eat cookies, you would need to eat 15 pounds every day to have the glucose your brain needs. It's true that there are other sugars in these foods, but they need to be converted into glucose by your liver. And this is a very taxing process that creates a lot of inflammation and also can impact your insulin levels, giving you insulin resistance and then diabetes. Likewise, you will need 8 pounds of caramel popcorn, or 4 ounces of dried apricots, which is much more doable, frankly, or a little bit of spring onions. Now, spring onions are not usually considered sugary foods, but they're one of the best sources on earth of the glucose that your brain needs. And of course, a little bit of honey just a couple of teaspoons a day will give you all the glucose your brain needs for the entire day. That is not to say that you should eat 15 pounds of chocolate chip cookies a day. It's just to make the case that some foods are better for your brain than others, that they're not always obvious. This is really important because we need food pretty much to do everything. We need it to think, to plan, to sleep, to move, and to make memories, like these neurons down here are doing. These neurons are showing synaptic connections that are responsible for memory formation. And they're using a very specific chemical messenger that is called acetylcholine. This is a strange name up there, acetylcholine. I will spare you the chemical information about it, but what's really important is that acetylcholine is made specifically of two nutrients. An acetyl group, which means glucose, again, is a byproduct of glucose, and choline. I will keep calling it choline because I'm Italian. I apologize if I do that. But choline is a B vitamin. We don't get to hear much about it, but it's really essential. And about 80% of Americans are deficient. If you are deficient in this B vitamin, your brain will not have access to the ingredient that it needs to make memories. And that's really a problem as we get older, and the brain function starts to decline gradually, and we have a time retrieving and retrieving information and building new memories. So 10% of your choline for today comes from your liver. Everything else comes from food. We do know how much we need. If you're a woman, you need 425 milligrams per day. If you're a man, you need a little bit more, 550 milligrams a day. Again, there are some foods that are very good for your brains, and in this case for your memories, and other foods that we usually think of as healthy that are not as useful. For instance, if you were to eat broccoli, you would need to eat 3 pounds every day. I know. That would be interesting. Or you can drink 3 liters of milk a day, or you can eat a pound of chicken, or just a couple of eggs. Eggs are an excellent brain food. They contain a lot of this very precious B vitamin. And even better than that, caviar. Just 2 teaspoons of caviar per day will give you all the choline your brain needs for the entire day. Actually, your brain and your body need for the entire day. Who would think of caviar as brain food? Probably no one, right? Yes, but it's a fantastic, fantastic brain food. This is really important to know because genes load the gun, but lifestyle really, really pulls the trigger. So as scientists and as clinicians, we should really start thinking and asking ourselves which foods and nutrients promote healthy brain aging and fend off dementia. This is a summary of many, many studies we and others have done using brain imaging and trying to really catch your patients as soon as they walk in the door, do very thorough dietary questionnaires and measure their nutrition and really quantify the nutrients in blood, which is also a very important parameter, and then trying to correlate that with the status of their brain that we can check using brain imaging scans. So these are the nutrients that really have been shown multiple times very consistently to support healthy brain aging. Number 1 is a very specific kind of fat, omega-3. Omega-3 fatty acids are essential for your brain. Then we have some vitamins, in particular vitamin A, C, and E. These are antioxidants. Antioxidants are nutrients that really slow down cellular aging. They keep you young. Then we have B vitamins, the most important of which, besides choline, are B6, B12, and folic acid. These are really essential for a healthy nervous system, including your brain. Then we have vitamin D, especially for women. I think it's probably obvious as you reach age 60 and you go through menopause. But even before then, vitamin D and calcium are really good, not just for your bones, but also for your brain. Then we have some phytonutrients. These are nutrients from plants that we don't usually hear about, but they're very, very healthy. They're very important for your brain. They're carotenoids. You find them in veggies and fruit. They look orange in colors. We have resveratrol from red wine, so that's quite nice. And the last one, pterostilbene, which is an ingredient found in blueberries, and Sandy mentioned that before. We should all eat blueberries for breakfast. Then we have some minerals and salts, like selenium. Selenium is the most precious mineral on earth, if you will. It's very, very hard to find in food, and it's so specifically helpful for your brain. You can find it very easily by eating Brazil nuts. I don't know if anybody eats them. I never did until I started doing this research. They're really good and very healthy for you. Copper and zinc, you also want to have a little bit, not too much. Now, what is really a problem for your brain? What are the nutrients that accelerate brain aging and dementia? The answer is mostly fats. They're what the Heart Association calls bad fats. Transaturated fats, saturated fat, cholesterol. They seem to impact brain health as people get older, increasing risk of dementia. And also too much sodium, too much table salt, basically, too much iron, copper, and zinc. This really translates to too much processed food. These nutrients are everywhere in packaged foods, processed foods, fast foods, deep fried foods, and we should really eliminate them. Now, every time I go through this list, I think the tendency is to think, oh, I'm just going to run to a pharmacy and buy a bunch of pills and supplements. And the truth is that they don't work as well as food does. There have been many clinical trials that tested the efficacy of specific vitamins and minerals and showed no efficacy. Whereas we know from the literature, from our studies, that these nutrients are really helpful for your brain. And one of the conclusions is that supplements are artificial. They just don't have the same effect inside your body. Plus, when you get your vitamin E, for example, from foods, you don't just get one vitamin E, you get 8. Because every vitamin E comes in different forms, 8 different forms, and all these forms are contained in foods, like almonds, for example, of course. And so you get much more of the benefits. Whereas if you buy a pill, you only get one form, and so you have limited benefits. So, don't buy supplements yet, of course. Let's talk about diets. Diets are easier, they're much more comprehensive, and they provide all the foods, all the right foods and nutrients that your brain needs. Now, what kind of diets are really helpful to you? I think as a scientist, what's really important to us is consistency and replicability. You want a diet that everybody shows is healthy and works. And at this point, the #1 diet against Alzheimer's and dementia is the Mediterranean diet. You may think I'm biased, because being Italian, of course, I'm favorable. But there's plenty of evidence that people on the Mediterranean diet show a much lower risk of dementia, lower risk of stroke, obesity, and diabetes as compared to those on a Western diet. They also show reduced brain shrinkage, which is really important, especially as we get older, increased or preserved brain activity, and much lower presence of Alzheimer's plaques. So that's really good to know, and I will show you our experience using brain scans. This is a brain, of course. This is an MRI scan of the brain of a woman who's 52 years old and perfectly cognitively intact. Now, this is the way you want your brain to look when you're 52, and also after that. What's really notable, I think, from my perspective, and I read brain scans all the time, is that this structure over here, this little butterfly in the middle of the brain, is called the ventricle. You want them to be really nice and tight, as small as possible. You want your brain to be really, really close to the bone, all over, and you want this little thing over here, which is actually the hippocampus. It's the memory center of your brain, on both sides of your brain. You want it to be as big, as chubby as possible, and gray. Now, this is a very, very healthy brain. This, in comparison, is the brain of a woman who's a little bit younger, 50 years old, also cognitively intact, but she's been following a Western diet for most of her life. I think you can appreciate the difference. These ventricles are much bigger, and they're black, which means that brain tissue is slowly disappearing and the fluids are taking over inside the brain. The brain is not as close to the bone as in the case of the other woman, and this part of the brain, the hippocampus, has a lot of black around it. That is called atrophy in medical terms. It means that brain has lost a lot of neurons, has lost a lot of brain cells, and the fluid is taking over. This is the scan of a brain who's definitely at risk for Alzheimer's disease. And the only difference between the two women, as far as we can tell, is that one ate healthily and the other one did not. So you may think, well, that's just one person. But this is really found in many, many people. We have studies with hundreds of people, and on average, those on the Western diet have at least 20% smaller brains as compared to those on the Mediterranean diets. And they're not just born with smaller brains, it's just that literally their brains are shrinking at a much faster rate as compared to people who eat healthily. We just published a study I'm very proud of, where we followed patients over time. We followed them for an average of 3 years, some people longer than 3 years, and we compared those on the Mediterranean diet with those on a Western diet. And let me show you what we found. Right here on top, this is brain activity. People on the Mediterranean diet are in red. You can see pretty much they're remaining stable over time. They don't really decline that much. But those on the Western diet are losing brain activity at a rate of 3.3% a year. That's a big rate. When we started the study, they were already 8% lower than people on the Mediterranean diet. And we estimated that they actually started to differentiate a good 3 years before we even started looking at them. This is even worse in terms of Alzheimer's plaques. This is Alzheimer's plaques load. The more you have, the more likely you are to develop Alzheimer's disease later on in time. People on the Mediterranean diet show none to start with and just don't develop any for the whole course of the study, whereas those on the Western diet, they really start showing increased accumulation of Alzheimer's plaques at the rate of 2% per year. So there's a 13% difference when we started, and over a 20% difference just 3 years later. This is not good. This is not something I would wish on my brain, for sure. And these effects are very, very visible, I think, with brain scans. So first I showed you MRI scans, that is structure. This is function. You want your brain to be as red as possible. So if you're like 60, 70 years old, that's the way your brain should look like. This is brain activity, and the parts in red, so the entire brain should be in the red to yellow range and very symmetrical. So that should be as red as this. This is the way this person started when they joined the study, and this is what happened in just 3 years. You can see that this scan is much more green, right, than the other one. That means the brain activity declined by over 30%. This does not happen to people on a Mediterranean diet or a healthier diet. We then thought, well, is it just diet? Because, there's a lot more to lifestyle than just diet. There's exercise, there's intellectual activity, there's social activity, and of course there's vascular risk. So we did a very complicated statistical analysis that is called structural equation modeling, in case anybody knows statistics. And the point is that we looked at a lot of different factors all at once in a very large study population. No, thank you. And we compared physical activity, intellectual enrichment, as education, intellectual activity. We looked at diet, we looked at homocysteine, we looked at cholesterol, hypertension, overweight, insulin sensitivity, and the brain. And what we found is that diet is the #1 factor, accounting for everything else you can do, that really affects your brain as you get older. That is especially together with insulin sensitivity. So if your diet promotes insulin resistance, your brain suffers. And you start suffering when you're 30 years old, 40 years old, and for the rest of your life. So, to summarize, a Mediterranean-style diet has been shown over and over again to keep your brain younger. In some studies, it's at least 3 years of protection. Whereas a Western diet gives you twice the risk of dementia, and I'm going to add to cancer, especially for women. It's just been shown in a very, very large study. We also have clinical trials showing that you don't need to move to Italy to follow a Mediterranean-style diet. You can do it easily wherever you are in the world, even in Finland. So this is a very large clinical trial, the FINGER study, very, very famous in my field, where they showed that a multimodal intervention with dietary recommendations, exercise, intellectual stimulation, and vascular risk improved cognitive performance in as little as 2 years in over 1,000 people aged 60 to 80 years of age. The best results were for executive function that improved by over 80% and processing speed that improved by 150%. So this is a clinical trial. We can talk about causality. It's really the intervention that led to these fairly remarkable results. So then the question is, okay, so what do I eat? And the answer is that there are some foods that are really, really helpful for your brain because they contain all the nutrients that your brain needs. So you need to make sure that you eat them. And these are fish. Fish would be number one. And I find, as an Italian, sometimes I find it funny in some ways that Americans don't like fish. Do you like fish? You do? Oh, that's wonderful. Sushi. So fatty fish like salmon, mackerel, trout, and sardines are very healthy for your brain. The recommended dose is the recommendation is 2 to 3 servings per week. Greens, obviously, leafy greens, broccoli, cauliflower, any veggies, at least once or twice a day. The best kind of fruit you can eat is really berries, and many people will say blueberries, but in reality, blackberries are actually better for you. They have a much stronger antioxidant capacity, and they're totally underestimated in this country. I strongly vouch for blackberries if you can find them. Extra virgin olive oil was shown to really make a difference in clinical trials. And so did nuts and seeds, at least 3 servings per week. Whole grains, legumes, and sweet potatoes are healthy, complex carbohydrates that help stabilize blood sugar levels and really help with cognition. Eggs, they're good brain foods. Yogurt or fermented veggies like sauerkrauts, really important, especially for mood. Red wine, 1 glass for women, 1 or 2 small glasses for men. And drink water. Never forget, your brain is 80% water. The brain needs water for every single chemical reaction to take place, and so many people are mildly dehydrated, especially in the United States, where when you drink water, you get purified water, you get distilled water, you get club soda, you get seltzer. That is not water. Your brain needs spring water, mineral water, tap water, as long as it's safe, that contains the electrolytes and the minerals that your brain needs to stay hydrated. I would just say that even a very mild dehydration level, like a 2 to 4% water loss, will give you neurological signs. Will give you fatigue, will give you dizziness, will give you confusion, and some studies show that it will really make your brain shrink. So there's just one recommendation I can give is really drink water. Now, for what you should not eat, processed food, as we said, fast food, deep fried food, refined oils, refined sugar, refined grains, too much table salt or sodium, and too much meat and dairy. A lot of people in this country love their meat, and it's totally fine, but in moderation. There are some supplements that are also shown and proven in clinical trials to be very helpful, otherwise I would not mention them. Omega3 DHA specifically is the one kind of omega-3 that your brain needs replenished on a daily basis. 300 to 500 milligrams a day is a good dose, especially if you're over 60. But if you don't eat fish, some clinicians will recommend a little bit more, 500 to 1,000 milligrams a day. However, I should advise you that omega-3s can have a blood thinning effect. So they can actually interfere with the action of blood thinning medications such as aspirin, for instance. So always talk to your doctors before you take any supplements. Never know. Choline supplements, 300 to 600 milligrams a day of alpha-GPC, which is the most available form of choline that you can find. It's really important for everybody of age 50 or older to take a B-complex vitamin with at least 25 micrograms of vitamin B12. Really, really important. If your doctor hasn't mentioned it, please do mention it to him or her. Make sure that they think about it, or have your plasma vitamin B12 tested, just in case. It's It's a big risk factor. Vitamin B12 deficiency is a risk factor for Alzheimer's and dementia. Vitamin E is really important, and coenzyme Q10 or CoQ10 or ubiquinone is a very good antioxidant that you can take if you haven't been eating enough veggies and fruit. So, to summarize, I would like to say that the same way that we eat, we save for retirement, we should really start thinking about how to eat for retirement. We are an aging society. It's really important that we take good care of our brains, and the foods we eat have a huge, huge role in our brain health, and we should all really think about our diets as something that we want to optimize for the health of our brains and vitality of our brain. So I'm going to stop here, and as Sandy mentioned, I did write a book about this if you would like more information, but otherwise I can be reached in my email or on the website. And thank you so much for your time.